Boss fights represent some of the highest moments in Final Fantasy games. And this remains true whether they be story fights that progress the narrative in dynamic ways, or terrifying super bosses designed to push players to their absolute limit. Bosses like the weapons in Final Fantasy VII or Yunalesca have stood the test of time for their challenge and remained in the minds of many, sometimes for reasons other than enjoyment. But while these fights can be long and grueling, there's another array of bosses that have required significantly more time to overcome. And this relates not just to Final Fantasy, but even extends to role-playing games in general. Players who defeated these bosses showed their dedication, as not many players have been willing to invest the amount of time required. So join us as we talk through 7 bosses that took the longest time to defeat across the entire Final Fantasy franchise, with the usual caveat that we'll only be talking about one boss per game. This topic though does dovetail quite nicely with something else that's challenging and takes a long time to vanquish: the removal of personal information that's being hoarded by data brokers. And that brings us onto the sponsor of this video, Incogni. Data brokers, who profit from collecting personal information and then selling it, are notorious for making it very difficult to get rid of. And with this being linked to spam, identity theft, and even an increase in health insurance premiums, it's frustrating, especially for those who live in the United States. With there estimated to be around 4,000 different data brokering companies now operating worldwide, the task of removal has also been made even more complicated, as you may need to contact every single one individually. That's where a tool like Incogni comes into play, as after scanning these data brokers to find out which of them contain information you don't want, it then automates removal requests and continues doing so in case the data brokers conveniently choose to only temporarily remove the information. Tech publications such as PCMag and TechRadar feel as though Incogni is very effective at its intended task. An annual Incogni subscription comes in at $7.49 per month, but you can get 60% off by using the link in the description. There's also a 30-day money-back guarantee if you aren't happy with the service. But with that, let's talk about some taxing bosses. Final Fantasy XV had a lot of marketing buzz leading up to its release in 2016. They had countless collaborations with the likes of Epic Mealtime, teamed up with brands like Cup Noodle, and also produced Kingsglaive and Brotherhood. But curiously, one of the bosses in Final Fantasy XV was given a surprising amount of attention thanks to an appearance on Conan O'Brien's Clueless Gamer show. Accompanied by Elijah Wood, O'Brien played Final Fantasy XV and encountered the hulking Adamantoise. It was at this point that a representative for the game claimed the Adamantoise would take players 3 full days to defeat.
That was just to suss him out, and then when you actually battle him, it takes 3 real days.
What's the point of all this?
And this statement then went viral due to the nature of the show. But even though the claims sounded outrageous, it was further amplified by Hajime Tabata, who stated that the Adamantoise would take 30 in-game days, the equivalent of 15 real-time hours, to defeat. Of course, when the final product was released, the Adamantoise gargantuan presence was somewhat exaggerated. But it did still stand as one of the longest boss fights to ever grace the franchise, because with its 5 million HP, even with a beefed up party, it would still take players around 90 minutes of continuous fighting to bring the beast down. But perhaps due to the extreme nature of the fight, it didn't take long for the Adamantoise to be adjusted. When patch 1.06 arrived, the Ring of the Lucii was modified to strengthen the Alterna spell. This modification meant Alterna now worked on the Adamantoise, and although it may take quite a few attempts, most players were able to win within less than 10 minutes using this new approach. Final Fantasy X has one of the broadest endgames of any Final Fantasy. It saw explorable areas such as the Omega Ruins housing the fearsome Omega weapon, and monsters like Shinryu and Nemesis calling the Monster Arena their home. But there was also the Dark Aeons, each of which posed a unique and devilish challenge. But it was the entity that appeared once the Dark Aeons had been vanquished that makes this list. Penance was fought on the deck of the Fahrenheit, and it boasted 12 million HP. This was then coupled with monstrous defenses and multiple targetable entities that regenerated on a regular basis. Because of this, the fight could take an incredible amount of time, as the player had to continuously look after their own party and monitor how often they were dealing damage to Penance. They also had to worry about a hidden bar that increased on each instance of Penance receiving damage. When full, it used Judgment Day to deal 99,999 damage to the entire party, and this could easily lead to a game over. As with any boss in Final Fantasy X though, players could remove any and all strategy by simply using Yojimbo. But if trying to beat Penance through traditional means, the fight could take a considerable amount of time. Final Fantasy XI is notorious for having some of the most arduous boss fights in the franchise, and that relates to not just Final Fantasy, but also gaming history. No other game has had news outlets reporting on the ridiculous lengths players had to go to defeat some of its toughest challenges. But that's what happened here. As reports started to come out, the gamers had spent over 18 hours trying to defeat a specific notorious monster called Pandemonium Warden. We're going to focus on another boss though, called Absolute Virtue, which was designed as the game's ultimate challenge, a true test for the player base. What made it such a challenge though, was that players had absolutely no idea how to even begin to tackle the fight, and even when strategies did start to develop, the sheer level of mechanical play made it nearly impossible to defeat. To make matters worse, when Absolute Virtue was defeated, Square Enix then adjusted the fight as they deemed the methods used misaligned with their intended strategy. They effectively accused the player base of using exploits to win. Ultimately, Square Enix ended up taking the unprecedented move of imposing a 2-hour limit to stop players spending unhealthy periods of time playing the game. This then meant if Absolute Virtue or Pandemonium Warden hadn't been defeated within 2 hours, they would despawn. But even then, 2 hours was still a very long time to spend on such intense fights with so many different facets at play. Final Fantasy XIII is home to multiple bosses that were considered for this list, with the Longui and Adamantoise being precursors to what players came to know from Final Fantasy XV. But while Adamantoises and Longui were noteworthy for their massive HP pools, persistent use of Vanille's death spell often made short work of them. There was another boss that stood out, however. After completing 63 Seathstone missions, Vercingetorix awaited as the 64th and final mission. Vercingetorix carried slightly less HP than the Longui, but was immune to death. It also had the ability to render itself temporarily invulnerable to attacks, dragging out the length of the fight. Poison would prove to be effective though, draining its HP even when invulnerable, and having a team of saboteurs to make any status effect stick was also a surefire way to keep everything from getting out of control. But although this did make the fight quicker, it could still last for a decent chunk of time. Final Fantasy XIV has never had boss fights that stretch to the lengths of the likes of Pandemonium Warden or Absolute Virtue. But the Ultimate Raids, easily the hardest content Final Fantasy XIV has to offer, showcase the truest of skills at players' disposal, needing 100% of all the team's attention for lengths of up to 25 minutes at a time. Of these, the Omega Protocol, added in patch 6.31 towards the conclusion of Endwalker's patch cycle, stood over the rest in terms of the sheer patience and concentration required to topple it. The raid itself was split into 6 phases. Each of them were either massively embellished versions of the Omega fight in its regular raid series, or brand new phases made specifically for the ultimate version of the raid. And to overcome these odds, the Omega Protocol required near perfect precision from all 8 players present in the party. Not only did they require immense knowledge of their own jobs, as they would need to perform their damage well enough to overcome strict damage gates that needed to be beaten within specific timeframes, but they also needed to execute the fight's specific mechanics, of which there were many. Ultimate Raids, including the Omega Protocol, have since become synonymous with the target of trying to gain the world's first completion. For the Omega Protocol itself, the race was won after over 1,000 attempts at the mission, taking almost a full week to finish. Now, the earliest Final Fantasy games on the Famicom did not have super bosses as we know them today, but they are the birthplace of some of the more iconic monsters such as Bombs, Flans, and indeed, the Iron Giant. So when Final Fantasy III was remade for the 3DS, Square Enix decided to revisit this revered creature, turning it into one of the most challenging boss fights available in any of the numbered entries up until that point. The Iron Giant could be found in a new bonus dungeon called the Iron Giant's Cave, but only after completing all of the other high-end optional challenges such as defeating Bahamut and completing the Dungeon Eureka. The Iron Giant did not boast gargantuan health numbers like some of the other enemies on this list, but compared to the power levels present amongst the party members of Final Fantasy III, the difference in stats made this fight exceptionally long and arduous. Due to ridiculously high defensive stats, in order to even dent the Iron Giant, players had to have party levels within the 90s, the Onion job at a high level, and the Onion gear. Luckily, the Iron Giant did have a weakness, magic. And because it dealt out so much damage, the most well-known strategy is to have all characters positioned in the back row equipped with 2 shields to protect themselves. At a time where numbers haven't been scaled quite to the level of millions or tens of millions, the Iron Giant stood out due to how punishing the fight could be. That then brings us on to Yzmat, which is one of the most notorious fights. Whereas Final Fantasy XI took the cake for how it impacted the multiplayer world in terms of length of fight, Final Fantasy XII did the same for the traditional single-player games, and this was via Yzmat. After hunting down all of the marks present in Final Fantasy XII, one final hunt made itself known in the Colosseum at the Ridorana Cataract, and players who found this hulking dragon had to prepare for a long encounter. Yzmat was less challenging from a difficulty perspective than other super bosses in Final Fantasy games, but the sheer amount of dedication required to fell it was so large that the game even allowed saving to break the fight into smaller chunks. This was further exacerbated by the fact that in the original version of the game, there was no way to break the damage limit with regular attacks. This meant players had to take well over an hour of continuously beating down Yzmat to even have a hope of defeating it and obtaining the Godslayer badge. But it wouldn't be abnormal for players to spend 3 to 4 hours or even more time. The Zodiac Age re-release of Final Fantasy XII did make this significantly easier, as all damage became able to break the damage limit, and a weaker version of Yzmat was added in trial mode with only 3.7 million HP. But the original version still stands above the rest as one of the most infamously long fights in the history of Final Fantasy. And with that, they were 7 of the longest fights to ever grace the franchise. Please share in the comments below which of these you've managed to overcome, and of course, any others you feel deserved a mention. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Christopher Milstead, Clever Chavez, Cody Keith, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory, Nate Hancock and Sukin TDK were super special Onion Eye supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.